Chapter 25. We have been looking at making a biblical appeal. Now, some people don't like biblical appeals. They just the idea of them is repulsive. And the reason the idea of a biblical appeal is repulsive is because the entire basis of a biblical appeal is humility and willing to submit to another person. And it may very well be that the person that you are appealing to does not have a position of authority over you. It's not a police officer who's carrying a 9mm. Okay? Did you hear about it a couple of days ago? Somebody started fussing with a police officer, getting into this big gargantuan argument, and ended up being shot. You know, you don't have to be wearing a uniform to justify doing whatever a person who has a 9mm in a holster tells you to do. He doesn't have to wear a badge. He doesn't have to wear a uniform. If somebody is armed, you probably should just do what they tell you. If they want you to eat asphalt or chew on gravel, then eat asphalt and chew on gravel and take it up with them later. Just do what they say. I find it incredible the number of men, primarily men, that get into a fuss with somebody. Tell me what to do, will you? If you've got a pistol, you can tell me anything you want me to do. And 99.9% of the things you tell me to do, I will do. Okay? Tell me to deny the Lord, and I'm just going to tell you where to jump off. But just about everything else, okay? Look mean at your wife. Okay, I'll look mean at my wife. Sure, that's okay. That's easy. But if you're going to make an appeal to somebody, it may not be someone in government, may not be a boss, may not be related to your church anyway, may not be a member of the family. It may just be an individual, and you find yourself in a situation where you feel it appropriate to make an appeal to that person for whatever they've said and done, a decision that they've made, and you very much feel compelled to seek from that person a new decision based on new information. Abigail, who we're going to look at this evening, is very much in a situation where she's going to make an appeal to David. David's not her boss. And there was nothing that David was going to say and nothing that David was going to do that was going to necessarily harm her in any way. And yet she felt it entirely appropriate to make an appeal to David. So 1 Samuel chapter 25. Now, just to refresh your memory a little bit, whereas Ruth's appeal was related to Boaz's need for companionship in his advanced age, Abigail's appeal to David was an effort to forestall his wrath and his perception of his need to vindicate himself to his men in response to the affront to him that came from Nabal. Our text, as I said, is 1 Samuel chapter 25, and what I'd like to do is I'd like to depart a little bit from the way we've done it before, where I'll read a passage and go through all of these particulars of a biblical appeal. What I would like to do this evening is kind of set the stage for the biblical appeal by making comments on verses as we go along, because we're going to read from verse 1 all the way through verse 41, but we're not going to do it all at once. And I'll make comments pointing out to you along the way the ingredients of Abigail's successful appeal to this young warrior named David. Remember, at this time, David is one incredibly dangerous young man. He's already killed Goliath. He's already slain wild animals with his bare hands, the lion and the bear. They have already sung songs about him among his people. Saul has killed his thousands and David his 10,000s. He is a brilliant man, able to trick Philistines And boy, the Philistines remind me of Democrats. I should prepare a sermon one day of how the Philistines are like Democrats. You say, how so? When they got their hands on David, what's the first thing the Philistines should have done with David when they got a hold of him? They should have killed him. Of course, they should have killed him. He was the greatest enemy their people had ever had since Samson. Okay, and what did they do? They let him off the hook, and they argued away his culpability and his guiltiness because he was smart enough to dribble slobber down his beard and act like there's something wrong with him. Well, half the people living on the streets in Los Angeles are pulling the same kind of stunt. Excuse me for believing the Bible, but so he's a smart man, he's a cagey man, he's a clever man, he is a ruthlessly violent man to his enemies, and this is who Abigail is going to be dealing with, and so let's not forget exactly who this guy is. He has killed a lot of people, okay? This guy moves through life with a hair trigger, all right? And he's in a culture, those of us who live in the United States very much do not appreciate what are called by anthropologists honor-shame societies. We have a sense of honor in the United States, but not much of a sense of honor. Europeans have no sense of honor. The French concept of honor is ridiculous. But if you go to some countries, if you go into the Arab world, they have what's called honor killing. For a perceived slight, a man will kill his wife, a man will kill his daughter, a man will kill his son for a perceived slight. Okay? Japan is an honor-shame culture. I don't know if China is since the time of Mao. They used to be. I don't know if they still are. I think the Korean culture still is to some extent. I don't know. Is a Philippine culture an honor-shame culture? I don't think it is much. Mostly just smiling and, you know. But in an honor-shame culture, a person will very, very quickly resort to violence, even if he thinks he's outgunned. If you have done something to slight him, if you've done something to tarnish his reputation, he will either kill you or he will die trying. And that's the kind of culture that David lived in 3,000 years ago. So in 1 Samuel chapter 25, let's read as the writer of 1 Samuel begins to lay the groundwork for us for Abigail's appeal. Verse 1, and Samuel died, and all the Israelites were gathered together and lamented him and buried him in his house at Ramah. And David arose and went down to the wilderness of Paran. Down doesn't give you any information by itself, because wherever you're moving, if it's away from Jerusalem, it's down. So down could be north, it could be south, it could be east, it could be west. And so with the death of Samuel, a new chapter in Israelite history begins. And if David had any protection from the old prophet, and I would suspect that David had some protection from the old prophet. The old man anointed him to be the next king, after all. This was the same prophet of God that anointed Saul to be king. And while Saul was willing to kill the priests at the tabernacle, he never touched Samuel. He never touched Samuel. I think he had enough sense, enough fear of God that he wasn't going to mess with Samuel. And so it would be beyond reasonable to think that Samuel did not seek to extend some kind of protection to David, so that even though Saul was hunting him, even though Saul wanted to kill him, there were probably certain things that Saul could not do because Samuel's influence over the tribes probably granted to David some sort of protection. So after they mourned Samuel's passing, David went to the wilderness of Paran, and that is a region, if you look on, you should never read your Bible without a map, a Bible map. That's a region that's far to the south of Beersheba. Beersheba is usually considered, from Dan to Beersheba means to the northern, from the northern extremity to the southern extremity of Israel. And so this place is considerably to the south of Beersheba, located on the north side of the Sinai Desert. So that's where it is, way down there. And verse 2, and there was a man in Maon whose possessions were in Carmel, and the man was very great, and he had 3,000 sheep and 1,000 goats, and he was shearing his sheep in Carmel. Now, please, I hope that you don't make the same mistake that I made for a long time of thinking by the word Carmel in your thinking that that's a reference to Mount Carmel in the north, on the north side of it now is the city of it's the most beautiful city in Israel, and I can't remember the name of it. Haifa, yes, Haifa. Haifa is on the northern slope of Mount Carmel today. Haifa is where Elijah did battle with the prophets of Baal long after this event. But this is not referring to Mount Carmel in the north. This is referring to the village of Carmel in the south. And so just as in the Bible there are two villages of Bethlehem, okay, so there are two Carmels, okay. That's the reason why Micah in chapter 5 verse 2 refers to Bethlehem Ephratah. So it's Bethlehem which is in the south. So there are two Carmels, and this Carmel is not a mountain. It is located in the south, and the man referred to but not yet named is an extremely wealthy man by the standards of that day. You say, well, okay, what does that mean? Consider the fact that under the law of Moses, and this is a Jewish guy, under the law of Moses, hospitality and care for the poor is institutionalized, okay? You are required to look after people who are in hunger. That doesn't mean you put them on the dole where you feed them every day. But if someone hungry comes to you, you feed that person in hunger, okay? So, with that, we read verse 3. Now the name of the man was Nabal, and the wife, and the name of his wife Abigail, and she was a woman of good understanding and of a beautiful countenance. So she is described well by the writer of 1 Samuel. But the man was churlish and evil in his doings, and he was of the house of Caleb. So Nabal is the rich man's name, and it means fool. I'm very surprised at the names that people give to their children these days. Most of them have no meaning at all, but in that culture, imagine his dad when his mother delivered him. So what would you name your son? Oh, let's call him Fool. Anyway, that might have affected his personality growing up. I don't know. Some kids growing up think that their name is stupid, simply because that's what their dad calls them all the time, or nitwit. Okay. But the woman is complimented as being of good understanding and of a beautiful countenance. But Nabal was churlish, which means he's a hard man. He's a severe man, and evil in his doings. Being of the house of Caleb informs us that Nabal is a member of the same tribe of Judah. Because if you'll remember, when they went into the land to conquer it, the head of the tribe of Judah was this man whose name was Caleb. He and Joshua were the only two who were allowed to enter the land following the wilderness wanderings, because they were the two that gave a favorable report, while the others and all the adults of that era, that entire generation, was allowed to die off by God. So, verse 4, and David heard in the wilderness that Nabal did not shear his sheep. Now, how in the world do you think David heard? Excuse me, David had his ear to the ground about everything. It's only the United States of America, excuse me, that takes a somewhat moronic view of intelligence gathering. It really did happen in World War I that the British Secret Services intercepted a letter from the Germans that was addressed to Mexico. And in that letter, they were enlisting the help of Mexico against the United States during World War I. Mexico was seriously entertaining the notion of attacking the United States from the south to provide a diversion so that the United States would not commit 1 million troops to the European theater of operations. Well, the British intercepted that letter, and when they tried to hand it to the American Secretary of State, he refused it. And his justification for refusing it was by saying, "Gentlemen do not read other gentlemen's mail." Well, I guess Jeff Zuckerberg's not a gentleman then, because I'm certain he reads all of my Facebook posts, or he has access to them anyway. But we know that intelligence gathering is from the time of the flood anyway. All right. David used spies. They sent 2 spies to Jericho to spy out the land. 40 years earlier, they sent 12 spies to spy out the land. Gathering intelligence was a very, very important thing. George Washington used spies, and one of the most important spies that he used was an American black slave who ran away from his master and joined himself to Cornwallis's headquarters, and he functioned as a servant in General Cornwallis's headquarters. And they assumed that since this man was an American slave escaped from his master, that he would therefore be on the British side. No, he was a very highly placed source of intelligence, and he found a way to get Cornwallis's plans to George Washington. And he did that over a significant period of time, so that George Washington knew exactly what Cornwallis was doing because of this spy working on behalf of the American revolutionaries. We know that the Confederates had a spy network. I've got a great book written about a woman who was a spy for the Confederacy against the North. This was a a Cuban woman who came to New Orleans to finish her education, and when the Civil War broke out, she was offended by Northern aggression into the South, and she decided that for the entire duration of the war, she would function as a spy. And she did so very, very successfully. For about 3 years, she passed as a very young Army officer. For about 3 years, she passed as an officer who was so young that he hadn't yet started shaving. That's how she was able to pass it off. And the idea of a woman pretending to be a man in the Army was so preposterous to the Northern troops that they never, ever, ever thought that there would be any possibility that this very, very young lad was actually a woman. So the Confederacy used spies. We know that Abraham Lincoln used Pinkerton agents. The detective agency used Pinkerton agents as spies in the South. And so the gathering of intelligence is just, if you've ever read, anybody here ever heard of Sun Tzu and the Art of War? Yeah. Stephen, you're just not a good Chinese unless you've read that book. Isn't that true? That's absolutely right. The book is about 3,000 years old. It was required reading for all Russian military officers. in military school. And von Clausewitz, when he wrote on war, the basis of that was Sun Tzu. And he talks about the fact that if you're gonna engage in conflict, or if you have an enemy, you better have spies. And if somebody from the other side is a spy, turns himself over to you, you get as much information out of that guy as you possibly can, and then what do? You kill him. Yeah, you say, Pastor, you're very harsh. This is called realpolitik, okay? So I have absolutely no idea that when it says here that David heard in the wilderness that Nabal did shear his sheep, that he had informants. He had people all over the place that just kept their eyes open and kept their head down, but their ears were well attuned to the conversations they heard by fireside and with passing crowds. And when it came time, it would be the time of the year for the shearing to begin. And David certainly was informed about it. And the implication might be that Nabal and his men are more vulnerable to attack from marauders than would ordinarily be the case, because their efforts are focused on gathering together and shearing their sheep. Because back in that day, they didn't have the kind of sheep shears that we have now. Anybody here ever watched a video of sheep shearing time in Australia? Oh my goodness. Oh my goodness. They have mechanically powered shears, and these sheep, they love being sheared because once all that wool is gone, they feel cool for about 15 minutes before it starts growing back again. So that happened. Verse 5, and David sent out 10 young men, and David said unto the young men, get you up to Carmel, and go to Nabal, and greet him in my name. So at this time in his life, David, as I said, has already become famous for slaying Goliath and for being the most valiant of King Saul's warriors, but he obviously is a fugitive from Saul's jealousy and is the leader of a band of men committed to staying alive until his reign as God's anointed to become king begins. So the only thing David wants to do is stay alive, okay? Because once Samuel anointed his head with oil and he became a Messiah, okay, which refers to getting the anointing, then he knew that because God is true, that someday he's going to become king. So all he's got to do is stay alive. Verses 6 and 7, and thus shall ye say to him that liveth in prosperity, peace be both to thee, and peace be to thine house, and peace be to all that thou hast. Peace, peace, peace. Think about that. And now I have heard that thou hast shearers, now thy shepherds, which were with us, we hurt them not, neither was there aught missing unto them. In other words, we didn't take any of their sheep all the while they were in Carmel. So the message conveyed to Nabal is actually threefold from this famous and fearsome fighter named David. First, Nabal is here reminded that he is a prosperous man. Why would David want to remind him that he is a prosperous man? Because people who are prosperous have responsibilities toward the poor. They have responsibilities toward the hungry. They have responsibilities toward the homeless. You don't hear much about that nowadays, but it actually is true. You don't hear much about it in churches, but it actually is true that people of means have responsibility toward the impoverished, toward the hungry, and toward the homeless. Okay? And this, of course, is a contrast to David's present hardship. Life for David and his guys is very, very tough at the present time. And Nabal doesn't have to have a brilliant imagination to realize that. Second, Nabal is the beneficiary of peace. Remember, peace, peace, peace. He's the beneficiary of peace that is guaranteed by David's protection, despite the fact that Saul's soldiers are hunting him. You would think that with Saul's soldiers hunting David, David wouldn't waste his time protecting other people, and yet he's doing that. And by the way, I'm not trying to criminalize David, and I'm not trying to demean him in your eyes, but David here is functioning in a manner very similar to a warlord, okay? In that he has to offer, for his own safety and security, he has to offer those under his influence, he has to offer them protection, okay? Go to certain neighborhoods in New York City, and depending on whether you were dealing with a Jewish gang or a black gang or a Hispanic gang or an Italian gang or an Irish gang, they expected you to kick back to them something for them to provide protection for you. Now sometimes the protection would be from them, but nevertheless, that's the way life is in that situation. And third, David reminds Nabal that he had opportunity to feed himself at Nabal's expense, and this in accordance with the law of Moses. In other words, he could have taken food, and he didn't have to ask permission to do it, because under the law of Moses he's allowed to do that. But he didn't do that, okay? So what he's about to do is he's about to humbly request food of this man Nabal. Verse 8, he tells his guys, ask thy young men, and they will, this is the message they're communicating, ask thy young men, and they will show thee, wherefore let the young men find favor in thine eyes, for we come in a good day. Give, I pray thee, whatsoever cometh to thine hand unto thy servants and to thy son David. So this is the request, okay? So Nabal is not to take the word of David's messengers. He's encouraged here to verify what they have told him by asking his own servants. Guys, are what these fellows sent by David, is what they say true? And notice also in this verse, David refers to himself as thy son David. So he's a young guy, Nabal is an older guy, and he refers to his warriors, his fighting men, as thy servants. So David is taking a very humble tone in requesting food from this very wealthy man. Beginning in verse 9, and when David's young men came, they spake to Nabal according to all those words in the name of David, and ceased. So they said their piece, and then they stopped. And Nabal answered David's servants and said, who is David? And who is the son of Jesse? There be many servants nowadays that break away every man from his master. Shall I then take my bread and my water and my flesh that I have killed for my shears and give it unto men whom I know not whence they be? Wow. So when David's men conveyed the message to Nabal, he answered in as insulting a manner as possible. Who is David and who is the son of Jesse? Of course, his answer betrays his feigned ignorance. How would you know that he's the son of Jesse if you don't know who he is? So he's given that away, isn't he? He knows exactly who David is. Everybody knew who David was. Saul has killed his thousands and David his 10,000s. And he knows who his father is besides. Then he goes on to insult David as he's just another runaway servant. Wondering out loud why he should give food that has been set aside for his shearers to men who come from who knows where. So in light of what the law of Moses teaches and in light of David's reputation as a warrior, Nabal's response is astonishing. Understand, David's got 600 fighting men who follow him. These 600 fighting men expect him to take absolutely no grief from anybody. For David to be their leader, they have to revere him. They have to admire him. There has to be a measure of fear, okay? Ask somebody in the Marine Corps if you could tell off 4-star General Mad Dog Mattis and get away with it. They go, no, 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 no. Well, in like manner, if somebody approached General Mattis and insulted him, verbally spit in his face, the Marines would expect that general to do something about it. Okay? And by the way, that's just the way fighting men were. How many of you remember Mattis one time was speaking to a group of men that were not in the military, and they asked him basically what was running through his mind when he got here. And he said, well, I walked into the room, and the first thing I did was look around and see what my possible points of egress are, and then the next thing I thought about is how I would be able to kill each and every one of you who are here today. Now, I think he did that for effect. I hope he did that for effect. Okay. But with David, his men are not going to... he doesn't have the complete freedom of movement or action that people think a leader has. Especially if you're a leader of 600 experienced warriors, you have very limited freedom of action. They are not going to allow you to let people get away with talking to you that way. And I'm not saying that they would do anything to David, but David would lose their support. And they would say, you know, I'm out of here. I'm going back to Aunt Margaret's house. You know, I'm not going to. If he's going to take that stuff from people, then I'm not interested in fighting for him. So, verse 12 and 13. So David's young men turned away and went again, and came and told him all those things. And David said unto his men, gird ye on every man his sword. And they girded on every man his sword, and David also girded on his sword. And there went up after David about 400 men, and 200 abode by the stuff. Now, we're not told the reactions of David's 10 young fighting men that had been sent with the message to Nabal and then returned with his response. We have not been told what their reaction was. And I think the reason we're not told what their reaction was is because we don't need to be told what their reaction was. We know what their reaction was. These young men are furious. I'm not suggesting that they did anything. I'm not suggesting that they said anything. I'm not even suggesting that their countenance at the time betrayed their feelings. I'm just telling you that on the way back to David, these guys were so angry they could have bit the heads off nails. They were mad because this man has insulted the man they were willing to die for. Okay? They have been insulted. They are furious. And it is all, I think, it's all they could do to restrain themselves. That's just my imagination, my opinion. Nevertheless, they returned to David and informed him what happened, and his reaction is entirely predictable. David sought to honor Nabal with his men's humble approach and humble request, while Nabal chose to shame David with his denial and with his insults. So David's plan will be to exact a very heavy payment for what has been done to him. Verse 14, but one of the young men told Abigail, Nabal's wife, saying, behold, David sent messengers out of the wilderness to salute our master, and he railed on them. But the men were very good unto us, and we were not hurt, neither missed we anything, as long as we were conversant with them when we were in the fields. They were a wall unto us both by night and day, all the while we were with them keeping the sheep. In other words, these guys are attesting to the protection David's men provided. Verse 17, now therefore know, these guys are talking to Abigail, now therefore know and consider what thou wilt do, for evil is determined against our master and against all his household, for he is such a son of Belial that a man cannot speak to him. So the stage is now set for Abigail's appeal. We now have all the information we need about Nabal, about David and his men providing protection for Nabal's interests. Should Nabal's men have gone to him? Should they have gone to Nabal? Well, look at the last portion of verse 17, where we read, "For he is such a son of Belial that a man cannot speak to him." So Nabal's own conduct prevented his men from believing that they could approach him. I know sometimes somebody will say, "Well, why didn't you come to me? Why didn't you come to me?" And that's often voiced by those whose dealings with others makes it impossible for people to come. The reason they didn't come to you is because they didn't believe that they could come to you. The reason they didn't come to you is because they imagined you would bite their head off. They imagined that you would yell at them. They imagined you would pay no attention to them. If you want people to come to you, you have to train them that they can come to you by the way you react every time in the past they have come to you. If you want them to come to you in the future, you've got to treat them in the past such as, you know, I'm really glad you came and said that to me. Of course, that's not good news to me, but I'm very appreciative that you felt I needed to know that, and I want you to know that I'm very glad you came and told me. Thank you. Thank you. Now, you may be dying on the inside. You may be dying on the inside. I know when I say that, I'm dying on the inside. But nevertheless, you have to reward people who come to you with bad news. Or else, the next time they have bad news, even if it's much more serious, they may not come to you. And you can't do anything about anything you don't know anything about. So, they did not go to Nabal, and verse 17 I think explains to us why. Knowing that she cannot go to her own husband, Abigail's option is to instead appeal to David. Now, what do we see here? We see that Abigail is not a perfect woman. She really should have gone to her husband. But she is convinced, because she lives with the guy, he's not a guy you can approach. He's not a guy you can reason with. He's not a guy you can talk to. He's not a guy that you will have success asking him to consider making a new decision based upon new information. Now, what should have happened? If Nabal was a receptive kind of guy, she should have walked up to him and said, are you tired of living? You realize that you just sassed 10 men who work for the most dangerous man in Israel? Nobody has killed as many people as he has, and for less reason than you've given him. Do you want to die? But she couldn't talk to him. So she went to someone that she didn't know. Boy, it's a sad thing when you go to somebody that you don't know instead of someone you do know. Because what you do know about the person you do know is that you can't go to him. Questions on this portion of Scripture? Yes, sir.
Is it possible that...
Louder, please.
Is it